politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The Israel-Iran conflict could be potentially the most serious and destabilizing development of this century. How far will Israel go and what will be Iran's response? Could America get dragged into this conflict, and might that lead to a wider regional war? Equally important are other concerns. How badly has Iran been hit? What impact will that have on its influence in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen? And finally, is Israel now established as the undisputed power in the Middle East? Those are the key issues I shall raise today with the defense editor of The Economist, Shashank Joshi. Mr. Joshi joins me live from London. Shashank Joshi, why do you think Israel carried out the strikes on Iran when it did? Do you accept what an Israeli spokesperson told the BBC, that Iran was days away from developing a nuclear weapon? Or is regime change the real intention, as Benjamin Netanyahu hinted to Fox News last night?
Good afternoon, Karen. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be on. Look, let me directly tackle your question. I think it's somewhere between the two. I am skeptical of the Israeli claims that Iran had accelerated its what we call weaponization of its nuclear program in recent months. I'm not a skeptic of the nuclear program. I accept that Iran had an illicit nuclear program, a weapons program, and that it has continued some weapons-related work even after American intelligence said that it shut most of the program down in 2003. But I am not convinced that at all that it was days away. I think that's a gross exaggeration. However, I think that what the Israelis saw was a window of opportunity composed of a number of parts. It was based in part on the weakness of Iran, which suffered grave damage to its missile stockpiles and missile production capacity in those exchanges with Israel in April and October of last year that you will recall. It was the weakness of its allies in the region, notably the collapse of its proxy network, Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, to some degree the Syrian state with Bashar al-Assad. And the Israelis judged that had this continued, Iran might have been able to rebuild some of those stockpiles. It may have had the capacity to produce perhaps upwards of 50 missiles each year. And so it was more opportune to strike now, particularly with a reasonably ideologically sympathetic president in the White House, than to wait to a period where the nuclear program may not have changed, but Iran's capacity to retaliate through proxies, through its own missile forces, would have been considerably more enlarged. And that timing, that question of sequencing and closing windows, which of course in history has driven so many people to initiate conflicts in a preventive fashion, is what I believe lay at the heart of Israel's decision to go early on that Friday morning.
Let me explore this a little further with you. Let me throw something into the mix. To what extent was the strike on Iran a deliberate diversion from Gaza? The strike happened on the 13th, and on the 17th, which is tomorrow, the French-Saudi two-state solution summit starts in New York. Were the strikes designed to deflect attention? Because now Gaza definitely feels like a sideshow.
I think I understand that argument. I'm skeptical of it as well, because although I think it is true that Gaza itself has served, particularly the prolongation of the Gaza war, has served as a political expedient for the Prime Minister Netanyahu to avoid his domestic troubles, particularly to hold together his extremist coalition, including far-right allies within Israel. I don't believe he was in particular need of a significant diversion at that point. It's true that the Saudi-French conference was due to be held. That is correct. However, I think that on balance, he had reasonably good things to show to a domestic population. In fact, they had just confirmed that the body of Mohammed Sinwar, one of the military leaders of Hamas, had just been found in Gaza. So I think that they genuinely and sincerely believe that the Iranian nuclear weapons program posed a huge long-term threat to the existential survival of Israel. I may quibble on the timing, on the question of imminence. I believe this was a preventive campaign, not a preemptive campaign, but I am not sure that Gaza itself is necessarily the key driver in this sense.
Let me then ask you a further question. To what extent did the IAEA resolution of Thursday, just literally 24 hours before the strikes happened, finding Iran guilty of breaching its nuclear commitments, provide some sort of, I'm not sure whether it's explanation or justification for the Israeli strikes?
I think it undoubtedly bolstered the Israeli pretext that Iran was moving towards a nuclear bomb. However, according to the sources that I and my colleagues have spoken to, Israel's Air Force was placed on to a couple of things. The planning for this operation probably began last year in the autumn, probably around the time that Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, was assassinated in Beirut, because Israel will have judged that A, Iran's retaliatory capacity would have been falling away at that stage, and B, the collapse of its proxies would have increased and intensified its incentive to go for a bomb. So this would have been in the pipeline for a while. On the precise decision to launch, my understanding is that the Israeli Air Force was placed on alert, ready to conduct this operation on June 9th, which is prior to the IAEA resolution. Now, that doesn't mean Israel didn't expect the resolution to come earlier. That's a possibility. But the timing makes sense because we did then see in the subsequent 2 days, America place its own embassies and missions in the region on particularly high alert, withdrawing dependents or authorizing the withdrawal of dependents. So my point is, I think that this was the operation may have been set into motion at least 4 days prior to that Friday morning of the strikes actually beginning.
Let's then at this point focus on the strikes themselves. How surprised were you to find that Israel had established a drone base near Tehran and that Mossad commandos were operating allegedly deep inside Iran? According to Reuters, this is how many of the Iranian radars and surface-to-air missile launchers were taken out.
You know, our mind is quite self-evidently drawn to the example of Ukraine, which in Operation Spider's Web infiltrated large truckfuls of one-way attack munitions, drones, to attack Russian strategic aviation, perhaps less than 2 weeks ago, an operation which was audacious, astounding, and pretty successful in attacking destroying or damaging a dozen or so of Russian planes. However, I think what people tend to forget is that it was the Mossad that has had much more experience of these kinds of operations. In 2020, I remember Israel succeeded in killing Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was the head of Iran's nuclear weapons program at the time, the chief scientist leading that program, using a robotic means of assassination. So in other words, not necessarily having to have large numbers of operatives on the ground in the manner of a Second World War type raid, but conducting a raid through remote standoff technology. And I don't think this is the first time that Iran has smuggled drones into Israel, into Iran, because if you recall the strikes last year, when they attacked an Iranian air defense site in near Natanz, I think it was Nesfahan province, there were reports of quadcopters attacking the site as distraction for the main attack. You do not fly a quadcopter from Israel to Iran, right? Anyone looking at the distances, anyone who has played with a quadcopter at home as a hobbyist will understand that's not the distances at which they operate. So this is not the first time they have done this. But the overall story here, Karan, the lesson of this operation is the degree of astonishing intelligence penetration of Iran at all levels, whether it is the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, in a guest house in Tehran, whether it is the killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in 2020, whether it's the exfiltration of Iran's nuclear archives from a warehouse in Tehran to Israel. All of these operations should mean that they should not surprise us when the Israelis can pull off a feat like this, getting drones within reach of Iranian air defense systems and missiles.
You're absolutely right. And this time round, Tehran has accepted that 5 of its top generals, including the head of the armed forces and the head of the Revolutionary Guard, were killed. And Israel claims that 9 Iranian nuclear scientists were also killed. Doesn't that suggest that Israel had incredibly accurate information about where they were, and it had an amazing capacity to pinpoint target them, both of which sound almost as if they're out of a fiction novel?
I don't think I have ever seen a feat of intelligence success in this wartime context in the modern era as remarkable, complete, and exhaustive as what Israel has achieved against Iran. The capacity of a Jewish state to act in a Shia Muslim country, which does not share a contiguous land border, in which it is extremely difficult to operate, a police state in which Iranians' Ministry of Internal Security, MOIS, and the Revolutionary Guards maintain considerable control. This is both a testament to the resourcefulness, the inventiveness, the capacity of Israel's intelligence services, whether one agrees with their actions or not, I hasten to add. But also, I think, Karan, we mustn't forget the degree to which internal dysfunction, political grievance, socioeconomic rot can basically chip away at the capacity of a state to conduct effective counterintelligence. I think that's incredibly important here. The reason Israel is able to penetrate Iran to this degree is not just because it is brilliant. It is also because Iran is a state that has suffered from political and economic decay for a number of years, increasing the ability of Israel to recruit disgruntled insiders. And I think we should not underestimate that dynamic in these kind of intelligence operations.
So then at this point, how easily can Iran replace top generals and top nuclear scientists? Or does this create critical gaps, both in the military command structure as well as in the nuclear establishment?
I think it will absolutely create critical gaps. And there's 2 dynamics to point out here, I think, right? One of them is that the people going into these top jobs will be more junior officials with less experience, but we also do not know the degree to which among them may be Iranian agents, or at least Iran may have reach into their network. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that don't underestimate the degree to which this type of domination of the information zone, of showing that you have blanket surveillance and coverage, has a chilling and suppressive effect on its own. Because, Karan, if you were an Iranian nuclear scientist surviving, and you were told the supreme leader has authorized a dash for a bomb at clandestine sites, and you are henceforth authorized to work on a neutron initiator, an implosion device, the uranium metal core, would you want to pick up the phone to coordinate that work with your colleagues? Would you be concerned about giving away your location and inviting an Israeli airstrike, about picking up sabotaged communication devices in the manner of Hezbollah? I think that don't underestimate the disruptive effect on what we call C3, communications, command, and control, as a result of these kinds of early wartime operations.
In which case, let me ask you, how much damage has been done to the Iranian nuclear installation at Natanz? And maybe I should add to that, and maybe it's even more important, how badly is public morale in Tehran shattered? The BBC today is showing footage of roads that are jammed by cars that are fleeing the city.
I think we'll get on to the question of morale, but let me start with Natanz. Natanz is, of course, one of Iran's nuclear enrichment sites. It is buried, although not very buried. The main enrichment hall is about 30 meters below the surface. And what Israel has done is not apparently burrowed munitions into the hall, which would be more challenging. It has struck the power supplies on the surface. And current, you probably know this, but just to help listeners, uranium centrifuges that spin uranium gas, gaseous uranium, they spin very fast. They are not designed to stop. If they stop, they can become damaged. So if the power supply has been damaged, if the centrifuges have stopped, if the supply of coolant has been interrupted, or if the electronic control systems have been affected, much as occurred at Natanz with the so-called Stuxnet cyber attack 15 years ago, all of that could do severe and lasting damage to the chamber at Natanz. However, I have to point out a couple of other things here. Natanz is not the most important site in Iran. There is Fordow, which is buried considerably further underground than Natanz, and we can talk about that if you like. There is another facility that is effectively south of Natanz that is also buried, that is much more recent. And what Israel has hit in Esfahan is what we call fuel fabrication facilities. So that is the ability to turn uranium yellowcake into gaseous form for enrichment. And once you have enriched it, this is the crucial part, to turn it into metal discs that you can then use to fashion into the spherical cores or the hemispherical pieces that would be used to assemble a nuclear device. So Israel has conducted some incredible attacks that have done really severe damage to Natanz and to the fuel fabrication sites and to the scientists, but it has not hit Fordow. It has not hit some of the other underground sites whose purpose is not fully known south of Natanz. So in other words, the job is absolutely not complete at the time we are having this conversation.
In other words, there is a lot more work for Israel to do, which Israel, I presume, under Netanyahu is determined to do.
It is, although, as I have already told you, Fordow is 80, 90 meters underground. The common understanding is that Israel does not have the munitions capable of reaching to that depth. Right? The munition we talk about is called the GBU-57, sometimes known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the MOP. America has it. I don't think Israel has it. However, if it does, if it has secured a discrete transfer of the capability, it doesn't have the planes capable of carrying it, right? Having a large warhead is not always compatible with fighter jets that are meant to be optimized for carrying small, nimble loads. India knows that from its own history of tinkering with Jaguar and other aircraft for nuclear delivery systems in the 1990s. And the problem that Israel has is you could carry it with a cargo plane like a C-130, but of course that's not the kind of plane you want to be flying within range of Iranian air defenses. And finally, what some officials have told me is that their assessment, the official assessment, is that even if Israel had the GBU-57, even if Israel could deliver the GBU-57, even that may not be enough to penetrate to the depths required. You may still need some kind of ground operation to complement that. And of course, that would be immensely difficult given the ranges involved, the sheer size of Iran, and many of the other obvious factors in this.
So the additional that Israel needs to do to be confident that it's effectively taken out Iran's nuclear capacity may well be beyond Israel's capacity to do.
That is a possibility. Now, I never want to write the Israelis off because, as we have been discussing, they're capable of quite remarkable inventiveness. So you never know. Perhaps they have found a way to deliver multiple GBU-57s via aircraft we're not aware of. Perhaps that they have succeeded in conducting ground operations and infiltrating Fordow. Maybe they have people on the inside with conducting sabotage. We do not know. However, this is giving rise to the question of, if Fordow is not eventually struck, and there is still time, the first few days of this operation current have been focused on degrading Iran's conventional military retaliatory capacity as well as its leadership, then the question will become, is Israel asking the United States to enter this conflict to say, you finish the job with your strategic bombers, your stealth bombers, because what would you rather have? An Iran which is wounded but maintains access to nuclear equipment and facilities, or an Iran where the job is fully finished and completed and that is not in a position to build weapons for many, many years to come? And of course, against that is Trump's own quite profound and sincerely held antipathy to further involvement in the Middle East. I was just reading over his inauguration address this morning, and he says, the test of our administration will not just be whether we can end wars, but also whether we get into new ones. And that will be weighing on him in the Oval Office, I think, very heavily indeed at this point.
In which case, let me ask you specifically, Netanyahu has publicly said that this is going to continue for many days, possibly even for several weeks. Do you believe willy-nilly that America will be dragged into the conflict? Has Netanyahu got the capacity to ensure America comes in, or has he got the tricks up his sleeve that can do that for him?
I am highly uncertain right now, Karan. I'd be lying if I said I knew the answer to that, but my gut feeling tells me that he will not enter this conflict, that there is still time to go. He would be, he will be having that debate in the Oval Office, just like he has had on Ukraine, between the kind of what you might call the MAGA camp and the restrainers, so people like J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, of course, who has long been an opponent of bombing Iran, even well before her time in office. And these guys are veterans of the war on terror. And they will say, we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan in what we describe as forever wars. And America was scarred as a result. We bent our military out of shape while China took advantage. And we should never make that same mistake again. And on the other side will be people of a more traditional bent. People like Mike Pompeo, who is, of course, not Mike Pompeo, but I'm thinking of I'm thinking here of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Thank you. I'm mixing up my Secretaries of State. Marco Rubio, who will be saying, actually, this is our opportunity to complete this and defang Israel. On balance, Karan, I don't think America will get involved. I still think Israel will find other means to attack Fordo. If necessary, it may infiltrate people on the ground. But I think the obstacles for Trump to get involved, the threshold at which he will be dragged in, is very high indeed at this stage. This is not what he wants to be doing.
Before I go further, let me ask you that question about public opinion and the impact on the people of Tehran. I mean, the BBC is showing footage of roads that are jammed with cars fleeing the city. Has public opinion, has morale in Tehran taken a bad hit?
Absolutely, no doubt. There is a sense of shock, disorientation, and also a sense of enfeeblement that the government has proved so incapable of standing up to this assault, despite being a police state, right? And the question is, and we might contrast this interestingly with Pakistan and the India's and Pakistan clashes, where you had a government that could not prevent airstrikes on its bases, but did enough to persuade the population that it had secured the country's honor, that it had struck back adequately. That is not the case in Iran today. The palpable sense of enfeeblement is much more apparent and serious. And so some of that will be directed as anger towards the regime. But the interesting thing, Karan, is when this broke out Friday morning, I spoke to a very senior Western official who had worked inside Iran, with Iran, very closely. And he said the key is this attack going to drive the Iranian people closer to the regime or drive a wedge between them? Because right now, there will be people cheering on this attack, cheering on the death of the IRGC, which they hate. However, in the days that have followed, we have seen more attacks on Tehran itself, including in upscale neighborhoods that will shock many middle-class Iranians. We have seen language coming out of Israeli ministers like Israel Katz, the defense minister, Eli Cohen, the strategic industries minister, talking about that Tehran will burn, that Tehran's residents will pay the price, and Netanyahu talking about regime change. And while some of them will be energized and enthused by that talk, I think a great many will rally around the country, regardless of how much they dislike the regime. And I think Israel has probably crossed that line at this stage.
Did Israeli ministers make a strategic or at least a tactical error in that sort of rhetoric and speech?
Oh, of course they did. But you know this Israeli government, Karen, right? It's not exactly a highly disciplined cabinet singing from the same hymn sheet. It's a rabble of kind of disparate political interests, including people who were deemed too radical to join the IDF, people who are settlers, live in occupied territory, also more mainstream people, more mainstream officials. But if you talk to the Israel Defense Forces and the Mossad and others, my guess is that they will be holding their head in their hands at this kind of radical, belligerent, bellicose rhetoric coming out of some of the ministers, which they will view as completely unhelpful and contradictory to their stated war aims.
Let's flip the discussion and look at it for a moment from Iran's point of view. Iran has said that in retaliation for the Israeli strikes, the gates of hell will open on Israel. Does it have the capacity to actually do that? On the other hand, before you answer, let me also ask, are you surprised by what damage it has been able to do? The Prime Minister's office in Israel has today accepted that 24 Israelis have so far been killed, and Reuters is putting out news that perhaps up to 400 have been injured. So does it have the capacity to open the gates of hell? And secondly, are you surprised by what it's achieved?
I don't want to underplay that damage because Israel is a small country and it is reliant upon its sole functioning airport, which, when closed, effectively maroons the country and many of its people. So I don't want to underplay that. But I'm not overtly surprised because I saw in April and October of last year, Iran conduct very sizable ballistic missile attacks on Israel. But the defense was formidable. With American help, and in some cases with British, French, and Arab help, Iran shot down the majority of those missiles and drones and had pretty limited damage. Now, I also saw that Iran's missiles were less accurate at that range in the face of Israeli electronic warfare and air defenses than they were in the 2020 attack in January on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq when Iran struck America with great precision. So that tells us something about the change in Iranian accuracy, whether that is because of defensive means, whether that is because of the range at which the missiles are acting, or something else entirely. So on the first night, Iran conducted a salvo that was about, I think, 100 strong ballistic missiles, but that is about half the size of the October attack. What does that tell us, Karan? It tells us either that Iran was rationing missiles, or it tells us that Israel was able to suppress the launches, what we call left of launch. In other words, hitting the launches before they launch, or firing at the missile in what experts would call boost phase intercept, as it is taking off. When it is relatively slow, it is very bright because you can see the plume and you hit it at that stage. And this comes back to our conversation on drones. But the long and short of it is that Iran has not been able to get off as many missiles as I expected it would, because you want to overwhelm Israeli air defenses with large saturation salvos. That did not happen. And the other thing is, we are now on night, I think we've had 3 nights of this operation, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We're approaching Monday night, Monday afternoon in Israel and Iran. The barrages are getting smaller, according to Israeli officials and according to my colleagues in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem observing these, which indicates to me either Iran is worried about running out, or it is simply unable to get these missiles off, because every time it takes missiles out of its underground storage onto the surface, they are being identified and they are being struck. And by the way, I anticipate America, using its satellites with infrared sensors, is able to assist Israel in that process of identifying launches. So all in all, what I'm trying to say here is the Iranian capacity to retaliate is less than what Israel might have feared if we were having this conversation a year ago, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago.
In which case, let me ask, do you think Iran might actually move to close the Strait of Hormuz, or is that only something it will do in desperation?
Hormuz is an act of great desperation because of 2 reasons. One of them is that it would also affect Iran's own shipping and oil terminals, and that is a factor to consider here. But the other one is that it would be a step that would very much draw America into the conflict. And to date, America has not come in, as we've been discussing. So if America were to come in, that could result in far more damage to Iran's navy, to its military sites, to its leadership. I think the leadership will think very, very carefully before taking that step. And of course, it will also internationalize the conflict to a greater degree, because many other countries that depend on supplies of Persian Gulf energy, including in Asia, will also be very unhappy at any such move. However, I don't exclude, Karan, that Iran might mine or try to covertly mine elements of the Straits of Hormuz to send a signal without necessarily trying to shut it down completely. We could still see that move.
Tehran has also threatened that if America bombs Iran, it will in turn hit US bases in places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Now, as you've explained, the chances of America actually entering this conflict are minimal, if not even less. But how has this threat to bomb effectively Saudi territory and Qatari territory gone down with the Qataris and the Saudis?
You know what, if you think about the attitude that the Gulf states have taken to Iran in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly since the Iranian attacks on the Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq in 2019, the approach has been a sweetness and light in public, an incredibly emollient approach designed to placate Tehran and stabilize things, particularly as leaders like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia have sought to focus on domestic growth, development, stability above all else. It doesn't mean they like Iran. It doesn't mean they trust Iran. It just means that you could think of it like one of my colleagues has talked about a protection racket, right? They pay protection money to Iran in the form of saying nice things, normalizing ties. In fact, we just had a Saudi-Iranian naval exercise, I believe, not long ago. But basically, they do so out of fear. So they will be concerned and alarmed by the prospect of this threat. But they also understand, I think, that Iran also sees value in stabilizing the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. They do not want the Gulf states to join an anti-Iran coalition if Iran's leadership is under this kind of intense, sustained economic and political pressure, which could grow worse if Israel keeps attacking gas fields and oil terminals, or begins attacking oil terminals, I should say. So all in all, the Gulf states will be looking to America, but also to Europe for protection, including the Brits and the French. But I think they will judge that we can stay out of this as long as the Americans stay out of this. And if the Americans join in, I think that they will be very concerned that they could be next on the list for retaliation. One last thing on this, Karan, just to point out on a technical basis, Iran has many more missiles which have the range capable of reaching the short distance across the Persian Gulf to attack Gulf Arab states than it does longer range missiles capable of reaching Israel. And so that will also be a factor in everyone's calculation at this stage.
Let me ask you briefly to look down the road for me. If this problem were to continue, not just for days, but a couple of weeks or a month and a half, do you believe Iran might consciously and deliberately attempt as a security for itself to develop a nuclear bomb? I know you already told me why you think it's unlikely, but if this continues for a month, how much could Iranian thinking change?
Karan, I said it was unlikely. I was skeptical of the Israeli claims prior to that conflict. Now that Israel has attacked and is talking about regime change, I believe that this greatly increases Iran's compulsion for a bomb. And there will be a debate in Tehran right now between those who say this is the time to do it. Fordow is still standing. We have nuclear stockpiles that haven't been hit by the Iranians, though they will be watching them closely. We can divert material and claim it was lost in strikes and move it to clandestine sites and dash for a bomb. I don't think that's going to be easy, because not putting aside the question of whether you can move materials out of Fordow without being seen, putting aside the question of whether you have enough scientists to do it now that many have been killed, potentially more than a dozen, according to Israeli sources. You still have the issue of the fuel fabrication I discussed, right? You make the highly enriched uranium, you take it from 60%, and there's enough for about 10 bombs at 60%. You take it the very short distance to 90%, a process that could be completed at Fordow for all 10 bombs in about 3 weeks, or could be completed for one bomb in about 3 days. And then you take that all to a clandestine site, or you enrich it at a clandestine site over a longer period with fewer centrifuges. You then have to make that into the actual bomb. They make that into the fissile core for the device. They don't have a fuel fabrication capability for that. At least they don't have a publicly known fuel fabrication capacity. I'd be lying if I told you I had the full knowledge of all potential covert Iranian sites. On the other hand, on the other side of this debate, there will be some people, although a diminishing number of them, saying, actually, if we do this and American intelligence picks us up doing this step, then they will definitely enter the conflict and we are toast. And moreover, this is too great a risk to do now, because the Israelis will see us and strike us. Better wait, lick your wounds, reconstitute a program more slowly over the coming years in secret, rather than doing so now. That debate will be playing out, but it will be complicated by the fact that Ali Khamenei is a dithering leader who has been unable to make his mind up on this for many years, and that many of the most senior figures familiar with this program are dead or will be keeping, as I said, a low profile, avoiding meeting in known places or communicating over known channels. And that will complicate Iran's ability to make a decision as momentous as the one that we are discussing now.
Secondly, if this conflict were to continue for weeks, maybe a month, month and a half or two, how long do you see the regime surviving? At what point will this regime, under its contradictions and faced with the unpopularity that it does have to contend with, literally implode and collapse?
I don't know, first of all, whether Israel has the capacity to carry this on for months. Weeks, yes. Months, I don't know. Not just because of the disruption to Israel, but because, think about the number of flying hours being placed on these airframes, Karan, right? These have come off the back of operations in against Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. You are flying the entire Israeli Air Force, all the pilots, all the reservist pilots who Israel relies upon continuously. So this is a incredible undertaking for any Air Force. I can tell you for a fact, no European Air Force would be capable of this scale of operation. Right? That's remarkable given the size of Israel, the size of European countries and their militaries, but we just couldn't. We couldn't do it. So that's one. They will run out of munitions at some stage, although the United States could choose to replenish them if the US is willing to back a prolonged campaign, assuming that doesn't cause a problem for Trump. But if that happens, what happens to the regime? I don't know, but I think it depends on whether Israel expands its targeting. If they strike more more gas fields, if they begin striking oil export terminals, you could push Iran into an even more severe economic crisis that would cause massive disgruntlement inside the country, which we have already seen has been mounting in recent years. Over cultural issues like the hijab, the forced hijab, but also over a range of other issues, including falling living standards and political mismanagement. So I can't say that it is certain that the regime would be pushed into a collapse. I can say it becomes, I think, a very real risk. But the other point to remember is what replaces this regime, because the alternative is not some kind of cuddly liberal democratic system waiting in the wings. It's not the kind of strange, eccentric, pro-monarchist diaspora movements that you sometimes see abroad who want the restoration of the Shah. It is basically the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, who have been consolidating power in Iran in recent years. And you could be well looking at an Egyptian or Pakistani-style Praetorian regime. And that, I think, is the Israelis will have to ask, is that really better for us than a theocratic clerical regime that may not have been very favorable to Israel, to put it mildly, but did not have that kind of technical military willingness to push the country over the threshold of nukes?
Thirdly, what impact is this likely to have on Iranian influence over countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, where we've had for decades fairly close ties with armed militia?
I think that here's the great irony of this entire conflict, which is that it began on October 7th with a Hamas assault on Israel, a massacre inside Israel, in order to shock Israel and shake up a political situation that Hamas viewed was becoming ossified and sort of stale. What did it do? It resulted in a series of conflicts and events that caused the cascading collapse of every major Iranian proxy group or allied militia in the region. Hamas, Hezbollah, the severe weakening of the Houthis in military, though not in political terms, the collapse of the Syrian state, Iran's only major state ally, and the severe depletion of Iran's retaliatory capacity. And to put on the table a second irony in that regard, Iran built up these network of proxies precisely, doing so since the 1980s, precisely to make sure it had a buffer, to keep conflict at bay, away from Iran's own soil. And instead, those proxy networks were involved in conflicts that pulled the conflict centrifugally back into Iran, effectively bringing the war right onto its soil for the first time since the War of Cities with Iraq in the 1980s. So that is a very long-winded way, Karan, of me telling you Iran's proxy network has collapsed. It will be exceptionally difficult to rebuild. And I think Iran, I heard a comparison that somebody made. Iran feels a little bit like Egypt in the 60s, a great regional power that through its own mismanaged conflicts and political dysfunction has effectively diminished itself and will be diminished politically and militarily for some time to come.
Finally, Shashank Joshi, is Israel now, as a result of everything, the undisputed power in the Middle East?
I think that we're in a moment of Israeli hubris, which is to say that they have enjoyed enormous military success particularly in Lebanon, where they've managed to destroy Hezbollah, or decapitate Hezbollah, I should say, without suffering the retaliation on the scale that I and many others expected. And they, right now as we speak, they're flying fourth-generation planes over Tehran at will. Quite astonishing. So Iran has shown itself to be the undisputed military power in the Middle East. However, as with Gaza, I still think it has struggled to translate its military success into lasting political arrangements that allow the state to exist in peace on a stable footing alongside its neighbors and alongside its partners in the region in the long term. And I think that that's the bit that it hasn't solved. And today you see an Israel that has normalized relations with the UAE, that could normalize relations with the Saudis, but by virtue of the extremist coalition in power in Israel that is unwilling to articulate a political vision for Gaza that is acceptable to the rest of the world, they cannot capitalize on that strength by signing long-term agreements with countries like Saudi Arabia. When Syria's regime collapses, instead of finding a way to build a better future with Syria, they have chosen instead to occupy parts of Syria and attack the regime and effectively, I think, act in ways that would probably invite enormous bad will in neighboring countries. The Israelis, of course, will say, we live in a tough neighborhood, we do what we have to do, and to quote a slogan of an obscure football club in Britain, Millwall, nobody likes us and we don't care. And that's the doctrine on which we act and will continue to act.
So in essence, people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are literally attempting to snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory.
Yes, although on Iran, I will acknowledge that one could ask the question of what would success look like in Iran today? Because as I said, now that the regime has been attacked, nuclear facilities have been attacked, is there still a deal to be done in which Iran gives up the rest of its nuclear program in exchange for peace? That's what Trump wants. That's what he, on June 15th, yesterday, he said he wanted. Can that be done? I don't know. I am really skeptical. Would people trust Iranian protestations that they had given up the program? Would Iran accept intrusive inspections of the sort needed to verify that? Or would they view that as more penetration of the Iranian state by foreign spies? Right now, I struggle to understand exactly what the long-term political settlement is. But you know what? We have told ourselves for a long time there are no military solutions to these conflicts. I think what Vladimir Putin has done in Ukraine, what Israel has done in the Middle East, you have a generation of leaders who believe that actually there are military solutions to these problems. They can be solved, and sometimes they're the only way to solve them.
And Israel will carry on trying to do so.
And Israel will carry on to do so because this, we've spent a lot of time discussing Israel's politics, the coalition, Bibi himself. But let's be very clear. This meets with the support of the majority of Israel's population who see this as a necessary campaign foisted on them. And even if they don't believe the rhetoric that Iran was days away from a bomb, they know, they suspect, they believe that Iran was ultimately heading for a bomb. Whether it was next week or next year is less relevant than the fact that it was heading there, and that one had to act at some point before the window of opportunity closed. And so for Israel, there is a domestic consensus that sometimes these kinds of operations are necessary. However, if the end result is a wounded Iran that comes back with a vengeance, that continues to launch ballistic missiles at Israeli cities with casualties numbering in the hundreds rather than numbering as they do in the tens, it is possible, as you do in these conflicts, that you could see a change in the public mood and a willingness to settle on terms that would be seen as less than complete victory.
Shashank Joshi, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion and for the time you've given me. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you so much for having me, Karan. Good to be on.